Hello sewing friends, welcome back. Thank you for tuning in. This is going to be the final video in my corset making series. This is basically a what would I have done differently if I would make this corset again. So I'm going to try and go through this a bit chronologically, hopefully in order of making the corset. If you would like to see how I did in fact make this corset, I have 3 videos up on my channel at the moment that you can watch to kind of work your way through all the different steps. If you have any questions following this series, if there's anything that I didn't address, please just let me know. I'd be happy to answer your questions, though again noting this was the first time I had ever made a corset. I am not an expert, I am a self-taught seamstress who winged a lot of this. But I still think there's some stuff to be learnt from what I did. I definitely made some mistakes and I've definitely learnt some lessons along the way. I'm very sorry if you can hear my cat. He's wandering around being mad that I'm not paying attention to him. So first things first, let's talk about the pattern. I drafted my own pattern from Nora Waugh's book Corsets and Crinolines. I've spoken about this before. Just in case you missed it, I grabbed figure 38, which is on page 73 of my copy, and it's described as light French stays in white cotton. I grabbed this pattern and I drafted it up to my own size, which honestly I'm exceptionally proud of the fact that I took a pattern from a book and drafted it up to my own size. But you know what would have been much easier? To just have bought the pattern. There are a ton of corsetry places that you can buy, good corsetry places that you can buy patterns from. I'm not talking, you know, Simplicity, though, like if that's what you want to do, then Simplicity would be fine. But in terms of expert pattern makers, I will link a couple down below. The one that comes immediately to mind is Red Threaded. They have a bunch of corset and stay patterns from a range of different historical periods that you can purchase. You can even purchase corset and stay making kits for you to work from. So that would have been a much easier task from the get-go, was just to buy a pattern that was already made from a professional. Granted, as I've said, again, I really enjoyed making my own pattern, but there were definitely some fit issues with my pattern that I will talk about later. It just would have been easier had I purchased one to begin with. So if you're delving down that road, don't feel like you need to buy a book and create, you know, draft up a pattern from that book. You can very easily buy a pattern that's been tested by experts that are made for a range of different skill levels as well. So that's really important to remember, particularly if you're a bit of an unconfident sewer. You can buy a pattern that will make things much easier for you. Corset making doesn't necessarily have to be hard. Like, it's overall a pretty, I would say, people might hate me for this, it's overall a pretty simple process. You sew the panels together, you chuck in some like channels for boning, you put the bones in, you like, you know, you finish it off. It's not a complex process, I feel, skill-wise, but you need to know what each of those steps are and how to achieve them. So, yes, that's a very long-winded way of saying it's much easier to just get a pattern, and there is no shame in doing that. You do not need to draft up your own pattern. It is just easy to buy one. Just buy one. There's no shame in that at all. So yes, I definitely recommend Red Threaded. There is another pattern maker that also comes to mind who I can't like quite think of, but I'll link them down below as well because they are excellent, and actually a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about in this video I learnt from them. Again, I'll link all the information below for you. But yes, pattern aside, let's talk about actually making the corset. So in drafting up the pattern, I definitely made some mistakes. I'm pretty sure my waist is a bit too high on this pattern, and to be honest, not entirely, just like moving the curves down a little bit, but that's kind of, I think that one of the trickier things to adjust would be where the waist hits. So that it fits comfortably on me, because the waist wants to go higher than where my waist should go. And what that means is, I think what that means is that when I do breathe, I do get a little bit more restriction in my breathing, and I think it's because the waist is a bit too high for me. So it's just not fitting exactly where it should. I can still take a very deep breath though. I do just get some resistance, and I think that's because I'm getting pressure around my ribs where there should be less pressure. So I think my waist should be dropped a little bit. Also, I will show you in a clip, but up the top fits me really well. I'm really happy with how the top fits. However, around the hips, there is quite a bit of loose real estate in the pattern. Now, could fix this two ways. You could fix it in the pattern initially. Granted, a bit of looseness is not a bad thing. You do want somewhere for your body to go, seeing as you're cinching it in the middle. It does need somewhere to move down to, or up to, hence the boobs. But I do have a bit too much loose fabric, and I can tell because I'm actually having the corset fold in on itself in certain places, which is definitely not what I want to see. So yeah, definitely refining the fit around the hips a little bit. Another way to get around this would just be padding. I could go ahead and pad just all of this out so that it sat really nice and smoothly, and I'd end up with the biggest hips. I would have such an insane hip to waist ratio. It would be amazing. I'm not particularly fussed about doing that, particularly as I'm wearing these under things, so I'm not so worried about it, but it's definitely like a consideration is either I needed to adjust the pattern or I needed to pad it out a little bit more. The other thing to note is I have successfully left room for my stomach, but I've left a bit too much room. So the corset actually sits a fair way away from my stomach, and the way it protrudes, because I'm working with couture and there's boning, it's pretty stiff, so it's making my stomach look a bit larger than it actually is. Which, again, not the biggest concern in the world, but definitely something I might look at fixing next time. So on the whole, I think I did a pretty good job. I'm super happy with how the top and the waist fit, and I think I've got a pretty good silhouette, minus, you know, I would probably slim down the stomach a little bit so the front pieces didn't jut out so much. Definitely trim in around the hips a bit as well. But overall, I think I'm very happy with the way it does fit. There would just be a couple of fit adjustments that I would make, which again, if I just purchased a normal, like, professional pattern, I probably wouldn't have so many fit issues than I did, because I just made my own and I didn't pay as much attention to the folds in the fabric as I should have when I was mocking it up. My attention was really where it was fitting too tightly or coming down too low, because I added like an inch to the top. It was coming down real low. That's definitely a consideration during the mock-up phase, is don't just pay attention to where it's fitting too tightly, pay attention to where it's fitting too loosely, which may seem like a bit of a no-brainer, but apparently not. So yes, that's just a PSA for everyone. Also pay attention to where it fits loosely. It can be tempting sometimes to just focus on what fits tightly because that's what you want to fix. But you also want to make sure that you're happy with what's fitting loosely as well. So now talking about the actual making of the corset, let's start with materials. I went hard with materials. I was like, I need herringbone couture, I need steel boning, I need it all to be precise and exactly like what the professionals use. No, definitely didn't need that. So you do want to work with a fabric that doesn't have any stretch to it, and you want to make sure you're working on the straight grains so you're not using any of the bias stretch. But a quilting cotton, a calico would have worked perfectly well for these, and it would have been much cheaper and easier to source, and it wouldn't have been so difficult to put through my machine. I had to use the biggest needles that I had available to get through the couture, and I still really struggled. It took me a lot longer to sew, and particularly when I was sewing the cups, because these are very tightly curved edges around where the cups sit. They just ended up a bit wrinkled because the couture was so stiff. Now, I will note, I did not pre-wash it, which is probably a contributing factor here. There is a lot of debate in the corsetry community, and whoever else uses coutil, I'm not too sure, about whether or not you should pre-wash coutil, because basically part of the reason it's so stiff is there's a substance that is kind of like a glue that helps to make it really, really stiff. And when you pre-wash the fabric, as well as if you wash the fabric at all any other time, it washes away that glue and that stiffness, and that's not really what you want. But some corset makers do say that they wash their fabric at least once to get rid of some of it so that it's a little bit more workable. I possibly would have gone down the pre-wash it route had I worked with it in the past, but I really wasn't sure at the time, and I really didn't want to mess up my fabric because it was quite expensive. Even on sale, I think this stuff is like $50 a meter, which is, you know, not the most expensive thing in the world, but it is pretty pricey, particularly when you're comparing it to like $20 like quilting cotton. So yeah, it is totally fine to go with a cheaper fabric. The stays that the corset that I was basing it off was made from cotton, so realistically, you don't need to use a specific material if you don't want to. The idea of corsets are that they don't stretch, so you do want to stay away from anything that has stretch in it, and you want to stay with your straight grains. But beyond that, it doesn't really matter. I've seen corsets made out of satin, corsets made out of calico or quilting cottons, and quilting cottons are fun, so you can get into all sorts of amazing patterns if you went down the quilting cotton route. So there are lots of different things that you can make your corsets out of. It does not have to be just the one thing. It does not have to be coutil, particularly because it is a bit tricky to source. So moving forwards, let's talk about steel boning. So I have spiral steel bones in my corset. Some advice: buy the pre-cut lengths, honestly. I will say they are a bit tricky. This is why I didn't go down this route, because in my head I was like, I don't actually want to measure each individual channel and then buy like pre-cuts accordingly. Plus you can only get pre-cuts in certain lengths, so I really just didn't want to deal with that. And I didn't want to deal with having like a section of corset that didn't have like the end of a bone in it, because I want, obviously the bones just help provide that structure and a bit of that support. So I went with just a length, but the compromise of that is that I had to cut it myself, which does involve either buying specialist tools, which again are an additional cost to add. If you are getting into cosplay, not immediately, but if you're into cosplay and you're going to keep moving with cosplay and you know that spiral steel boning is something you're going to be working with a lot, it might be an investment that is worthwhile. For me, I was like, I'm probably going to make like one corset in my life. You know, I might revisit this years in the future, but it is not worth me buying a $50 tool right now. So I asked my dad for a pair of his pliers. They worked great. I can't tell you what kind they were except for the fact that they are pliers, because when I asked him, he just said they were pliers. That's the information I've got. So I do always recommend asking your other handy people in your life if they have tools that might work for what you're doing. If you're doing handy or crafty things, you'll find that, interestingly, a lot of them cross over. So yes, I was able to use my dad's pliers to cut my spiral steel boning. It took a very long time. I had to work really carefully because I ended up with all these tiny pieces of metal, which honestly I should have had protective glasses for, just in case, and I did not. So wear protective glasses if you're going to be doing something like cutting metal and you might get little shards of metal flying up at you. Wear protective glasses, it's not that hard, but I was just silly. So I had small pieces of metal coming off that I needed to pay attention to and make sure that I like put aside safely and make sure that none got on the floor. I also ended up with a massive blister on my thumb because it took so long and they were really hard to get through. So honestly, it was a lot of pain for not very much payoff. Yes, I ended up with my corset and I'm very happy with it and very proud, but at the same time it's like, this could have been so much easier, right? I didn't have to suffer like this had I just bought the pre-cut lengths. The other thing to note, spiral steel boning is great in a lot of ways. It does move very well and it is recommended in a lot of cases, except for, and I didn't realise this until after I bought it, according to some corseteers, no, according to some seamstresses, tailors, oh god, I'm just going to use the wrong word and offend somebody. According to some sewers who make corsets, you should use straight steel boning in your very centre back boning channels. So the ones that go right next to the lacing strips, basically, and not just the centre, but basically the ones that surround the eyelets, you want to use straight steel boning. Because spiral steel boning bends, it does mean that when you're lacing up your corset, you will get a little bit of a bend among the centre back seams, because the spiral steel boning is bending as you're trying to lace up, whereas straight steel boning will do that less. This is definitely something I've experienced, so in the future, if I make a corset again, I will be using spiral steel boning for pretty much everything else, except for those 2 points that go on either side of the eyelets, and I will use straight steel boning. Because I've definitely noticed that, particularly in the middle, my lacing buckles a little bit, and I do think that's because of the boning. The final thing I will talk about is the waist tape. So if you've seen my previous videos, you'll know that I was quite silly and I didn't fully think about when you needed to sew in your waist tape, and I did it after the bones were already put in. Big mistake. Your waist tape should be put in before your boning channels, I think. If I'm wrong, someone can correct me. But basically, you can't sew over your boning channels to put your waist tape in. So your waist tape needs to be sewn in before your boning channels. Mine is currently hand sewn in, and I had to use the stitching holes from my boning channels to sew it in because I could not get through this coutil with hand sewing. That was just a no-go. So I did put my waist tape in. It's there to provide you the additional support and structure that you'll need, and it's designed to help the waist not stretch out over time, because that is where you have the most amount of pressure in a corset and you want to keep it nice and snug. So a waist tape will help with that. In order to help with that, it needs to be sewn in properly, and it needs to be sewn in before you put your boning channels in. This was just something I didn't realise at first. I seriously considered not having one. I probably could have gotten away with it because I'm not going to wear this corset terribly often, but I wanted to do it properly and I wanted to do the full job. So I did put one in, but I put it in way too late. It's hand sewn in, so it's probably not very effective. But I did think it was worth mentioning. So yeah, when you're going through this process, and that's part of the reason why a professional corset pattern would probably be very helpful, is it will have all these steps laid out for you so that you know exactly what you're doing, when you should be doing it, and how, which is definitely something that I didn't have. Granted, I could have had if I did more research before I started this project, but I got really enthusiastic and I threw myself into it, which I feel is something that not only I am guilty of. So I am, on the whole, to wrap up, I am very happy with my corset. I think it's great. It's not 100% correct, but that is more than okay. I think it looks great. I think it looks great, and I am exceptionally proud of myself that I made it, because the reality is this took me like a month from beginning to end, so I can't help but be proud of that. So as I mentioned before, if you have any questions, please leave them down below. I'd be more than happy to answer them or point you into the direction of better resources than I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I really enjoyed making this series. I know it's been a long while in the making, but I hope that if you've stuck with me and you've watched them, thank you so much. That means a great deal to me. I hope you learnt something as well. good luck for your own sewing endeavours in the future. Always, if you have suggestions for stuff that you would like to see me make, please leave them down below. Have a wonderful day and happy sewing. Bye!